So glad to be with you and that Zachary is with us. I met Zachary, I don't even remember when, but when he was presenting one of his books at the gathering. Zachary was born and raised in Pacific Yearly Meeting, is a member of Strawberry Creek Monthly Meeting, and currently serves as professor of theology and psychology at Chicago Theological Seminary. Prior to his academic work, he served as a chaplain in multiple contexts with specialization in working with military personnel, veterans, and military families impacted by trauma and moral injury. He has published widely, including 4 books: Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families; Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injury and Identities in Crisis; Goatwalking, a Quaker Pastoral Theology; and Doing Theology in Pandemics, Facing Viruses, Violence, and Vitriol. Zachary lives in Chicago with his family and is having the most fun when he's coaching his kids' soccer teams. Welcome, Zachary. We are so glad to have you with us. And I just wish there were like twice as many people here. They're going to miss it, but we'll record it. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. It's really lovely to be here with all of you. Just for accountability, remind me how much time we have for this conversation versus the good business that you all have today.
Iris, is that 20 minutes? More than that? I'm forgetting. 20 minutes to speak and a couple of minutes for Q&A, as I recall.
No, it's much more like 45 minutes to speak and about 15 for Q&A, and then we'll have about a 30-minute break. and Zach, if you weren't prepared for that full amount, we will do just fine, but we sure don't want to cut you short.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm terrible. My memory is bad.
Can I suggest, though, that we start, Zachary, that you speak out of the silence? That would be wonderful.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
I'm happy to. Thank you. Very grateful to be gathered here with you all this morning, to accept the invitation that came through Joan, but to see a number of familiar faces that I haven't seen for quite some time, and to just feel the warmth of this community, and knowing a little bit, having crossed paths with QUIP over the years. Just very glad to be here with all of you. With our time and our intention today, based on some discernment with Joan, is an opportunity to speak a little bit about one of my recent publications entitled Goatwalking, a Quaker Pastoral Theology. So I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit of background, maybe about myself a little bit, and then kind of getting us a little closer to the book. I was raised in the Religious Society of Friends in California, and Quakerism was really the center of my life in really no uncertain terms. Both of my parents were just deeply involved in different roles and responsibilities in that community. For much of my childhood, we lived as caretakers for first one and then another Quaker meeting in the Bay Area. So Friends Meeting and the Quaker community were really, from my earliest memories, has really been my extended family. And I count that as a profound and formative blessing in my life. I got to know some of you through FGC functions, FUM functions, conferences, retreats, traveling in the ministry, a couple of years working at Pendle Hill. I really feel like I got to do a whole lot of American Quakerism growing up, and see from those different perspectives really just the richness of our tradition. Some of you may know this, but something happened in my mid-20s that kind of changed seismically my relationship to the Quaker community, which was I felt called to do work inside of the military as a chaplain with folks who were currently serving and with their families. And at that time, there were a lot of Quakers whose response to me basically boiled down to Quaker God doesn't want a good Quaker kid to join the military. And there was a sort of confidence or an assurance to that that really compounded for me the disorientation that I was already feeling in my attempt to discern that call, because it seemed like a really unlikely call. Not just for a Quaker kid, but for a kid who was born and raised in Berkeley, California, surrounded by the residual cultures and ethos of the anti-war movement of the 60s. And as unlikely as I felt that it was, and as assured as many Quakers believed that it was, I didn't find a way to relinquish or release myself from that call. And that, as I say, was very troubling to the Quakers and the communities that I knew. But for a number of years, I served in the military in uniform as a chaplain with first one and then another unit in the Marine Corps. It was, and really from day one and throughout the whole experience, was a very strange and unfamiliar place to be a Quaker pacifist kid from Berkeley, California. There weren't a whole lot of folks like me running around the military, and certainly not in the chaplain corps. As some of you may be aware, the chaplain corps in particular is very heavily oversaturated with dominionist, fundamentalist evangelical Christians. And I use those qualifiers because there are certainly evangelical Christians who are not nearly as rigid and sort of so wired as some of the chaplains in the military chaplain corps. But what I found, again, also very surprising, as uncomfortable as it was to do the work that I was doing in many ways, because of the kinds of differences of cultures and expectations, was that there was a lot of the Quaker me that was really well used in doing chaplaincy work, even in a military context. And it really energized and challenged me to think about the ways in which our Quaker tradition, from my perspective, really has a great deal to contribute and participate in conversations around chaplaincy, around pastoral and spiritual care more broadly. So I could probably share a lot more about that experience and in our conversation time. If folks would like to hear more of that part of my journey, I'm more than willing to share. But ultimately, as I was doing that work, one of the things that wasn't a very good fit for me in the military is I had a little too much brains with me in that process. The military operates in large part out of a certain kind of traditioning, right? The military has always done it this way. The military will continue to do it this way, would be sort of shorthand for that. And I always had a problem kind of turning my brain off and just kind of going with that flow. And so one of the ways that I found some balance in the midst of that was by entering a PhD program and continuing to pursue advanced study in theology and psychology at the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology. And what I was interested in a particular way was the moral dimension of trauma. And sometimes that kind of moral trauma is referred to as moral injury. And so my dissertation work and some of my publications have really focused on that area. But one of the things that happened very early on in my doctoral program was I was sitting in this doctoral seminar, and this luminary, this scholarly giant, was my professor, the professor that I had really come to work with in my program. And he was the student of a generation before a very significant kind of pastoral theologian type. So you're sort of getting some of the intergenerational kind of legacies in the room. And one of the things that my teacher's teacher had been really noted for in his publishing was developing something called a shepherding perspective. It was sort of his way of describing pastoral care and pastoral theology by really leaning into the pastoral image and metaphor of shepherding. His name is Seward Hiltner. If you really want to get serious in my citations here, but I wouldn't necessarily send you in that direction, and you'll begin to hear why as I go further in my description of what happened next. But as I was getting oriented with pastoral theology and pastoral care and seeing what Hiltner was doing with the shepherding perspective, I really found myself very curious, if not suspicious, that sort of one of two things was happening in the academic discourse, the kind of guild of pastoral theology. One was this kind of Hiltner orientation that was at least engaging with pastoral imagery and metaphor with this shepherding image. But most of the rest of the folks had just totally ditched that altogether. They were using other images, other metaphors that didn't have anything to do with pastoral at all. And I thought that was kind of curious. I thought, well, gosh, if we're going to call our thing pastoral theology or pastoral care, we should probably be accountable to kind of what comes along with that word. But I didn't really love what Hiltner's legacy at least offered with the shepherding stuff, because I thought, gosh, shepherd, again, I see the sort of biblical connection in some of those narratives, but I don't really see myself in ministry as a shepherd. The people that I work with are really not like sheep in any time that I can think of. And even the kind of pristine, shepherd with the sheep in the beautiful lush green pastures, and all the shepherd has to do is to find the best, sources of water and all this lushness and that kind of thing. And I thought, gosh, that doesn't really sound like the places and the spaces that I've done ministry. Those places are hard places. They're places where there's not a lot of lushness and not a lot of fresh water. It's more like wilderness, desert kinds of spaces. So what began in that seminar was basically me breaking the heart of my doctoral advisor, really from the very first few weeks that we were working together, which was, I said, I think this Hiltner legacy thing is not going to be sufficient, but I do really want to pay some attention to pastoral as an image, as a metaphor, and take that seriously. And so what I proposed to my doctoral advisor is that we should seriously consider Jim Corbett's Goatwalking as an alternative pastoral image and metaphor to inspire pastoral care in the 21st century. And I just thought this was the most pleasing light bulb that had ever gone off in my mind. And I had loved Corbett's writing for a long, long time. And if you know Corbett's Goatwalking book, it says as explicitly and directly, probably the only thing that Corbett says directly in the book at all, is he says, do not read this book like a scholar, like an academic. You know, don't take it too seriously the way that academics take things too seriously. So I had now not only betrayed my doctoral advisor, I was now just right in the most confrontational way, also betraying Corbett, who I love much more than my doctoral advisor, to be sure at this point, but utterly betray him as well by taking his work and really appropriating it in a way that, again, as I say, he could not have been more direct. He did not want me to mistreat his text the way that I have mistreated his text. So again, I want to be very transparent about that, that I have done a great misdeed, if not a sin, and I apologize to Corbett for doing it. But what I found in Corbett's description of goat walking was both fiercely and boldly pastoral, what he describes as free-range pastoralism, and the substance of his practice and the philosophy that emerges from his practice of goat walking really substantiated, I thought, much more significantly, both significantly pastoral, but also significantly liberative theological commitment that Hiltner certainly doesn't get to. The Shepherd doesn't leave a whole lot of room for pastoral care or spiritual care as liberative action. Some of the folks who come along after Hiltner try to sort of tag some stuff on there, including my doctoral advisor, really went above and beyond to try to redeem Hiltner in this way. But Hiltner's not wired for that. He spends, well, I don't know if there's any graduate from Princeton, so I won't go too much into my critique of Princeton here, but he's just not interested in that, and we'll leave it at that. Whereas Corbett, that's the beginning, middle, and end of his work, right? He's not doing this as a way to be cute. This isn't, I'm interested in walking around with goats because, you know, I am, you know, preparing for the apocalypse, and I've got my canned food back in the bunker, and I need to think about how to, you know, live in the after times, right? He's not geared in terms of some of the kind of apocalyptic living that we see here and there in different niches in our society now. He was doing this from a place of deep commitment, recognizing that if we don't periodically and sincerely unplug ourselves from really the American empire project, that we will continue to be bound by its ethos in very significant ways. And so he's doing this unplugging, this wandering, not without meaning, but actually with very deep meaning and purpose. And in the course of doing it, he's actually mapping out the trails that asylum-seeking refugees are still using to this day, right? So the very practical legacy that Corbett leaves is not just this sort of Don Quixote, you know, kind of character and philosopher in his writing, but also, again, very practically has contributed something that, from my perspective, is a beautiful and lasting legacy of his sense of activism born from his faith in that kind of way. So in this way, Corbett works, at least for me, right? I won't speak for anybody else. But what I loved about this was it became a place where some of the richness of my Quaker tradition, I felt, really had something to contribute to this academic field of pastoral theology. And while my doctoral advisor hated the paper that I wrote about this and really tried to talk me out of it, because I was a good Quaker, I was very contrarian, and this only emboldened my belief that no, in fact, maybe there was some truthfulness here that needed to continue to garner my attention. So by the time I get around to working on this publication for Brill, which was published about a year and change ago, a part of a Brill series that, again, some of you may already be well aware of, that was sort of framed as, some emerging ideas, emerging voices from religious studies and theology, talking about Quaker studies. And there's a number of really good volumes already published in this line. And they approached me about this, and they said, would you be interested in writing something like this? And I said, well, what I would really like to be able to return to are these conversations about pastoral theology and Quakerism. There's not really very much written out there about it, and it could be interesting. They gave me the go-ahead, so I think you follow the yeses when you find the yeses, and I re-engage this material, and I talk about this book in the introduction as really a kind of love letter to two communities that I love very deeply. And the first half of the book is a kind of a love letter to this academic guild of pastoral theology, saying, let's really grapple with Hiltner's legacy and with what we mean by pastoral. And if we're going to keep calling ourselves pastoral theologians, let's really grapple with the bias and the assumptions, the implications of pastoral metaphor. And if you, like me, feel kind of wary and worn out by Hiltner's sort of control of pastoral metaphor and image, join me in reading Corbett's Goatwalking as a sort of alternative. And then the second half of the book is really a love letter very much to my Quaker community, and with a different angle, really, in those pages. And that is, again, my 2 cents is that Quakers have some really valuable stuff within our tradition. We're the keepers of that, the stewards of that, that have a lot to contribute to this broader discourse and this broader work of pastoral care ministry. And in academic ways, ways that would be interesting theoretically and conceptually in academic spaces, but also very much in practical ways. And here Corbett is also, again, probably from his perspective, somewhat resistantly, a kind of highlighted luminary to this, to say, Corbett is serious about his Quakerism, and even though he's not serving as a chaplain, the work that he's doing, has these really deep wells of resonance with our tradition and with our identity. And even if you don't buy any of what I have to say, at the very least, go read Corbett's Goatwalking, because there's really good stuff in there, and it doesn't get read nearly enough. And it might take you in any number of directions, because Corbett's volume is, it's Bible study, it's philosophy, it's literary critique, it's grumpiness, it's recipe. I mean, there's so much stuff in that volume. It's not for everybody, but it really is just a remarkable piece of writing in so many ways. So what I attempt to do in the second half of the book, if I can get anyone's attention, is I would like friends to think about the work that we do together in community, and even if we have never even thought about that work as being pastoral care, there are a number of practices within our tradition that, whether we call it pastoral care or not, really do functionally serve as pastoral care, and certainly have some real value, I think, to pastoral care in that way. So in the second half of the book, I try to do at least somewhat of a reading of our tradition that tries to bring some of those questions, those, where is pastoral care here? How do Quakers care? And from our very first generations of friends, reading that writing, again, you won't find pastoral care necessarily as a concept in those generations of writing, or very much since then. But there's a lot of stuff there that speaks, as I say, to how we care for one another, how we navigate crisis as a community, what we believe about God in the midst of crisis, right? These are all things that are fundamental to pastoral theology and pastoral care. So my hope for the book was not to have a kind of exhaustive and finalizing kind of word on this, but rather to just, I don't know, jump up and down and wave my arms in the air maybe a little bit and say, you know, friends, are you interested in this conversation? You know, what canst thou say, in other words, about your experience amongst friends and where you see this? And some of you may know this, some of you may be, this may be a part of your lived experience, but you know, there's a lot of Quakers out there doing chaplaincy work out in the world. And there's a lot of friends that do that work, again, in different names and maybe with less formalized designation within our communities, right? Sometimes it's called eldering, right? Sometimes it's called ministry. Sometimes it's called care of the meeting, right? I mean, we have called it different things in different communities. I think claim it and name it differently, and I'm okay with that. Again, I don't feel any impulse to try to standardize any of this for us. I don't think there's much utility in that. But if we were to sort of attend to the questions, would it help us perhaps to see more clearly the needs within our community, as well as the needs beyond our community that our ministry, in fact, has an opportunity to extend to? And of course, I can say that, right? Because I thought I'm still being a Quaker, even though I'm serving in the most unlikely place. And even though a bunch of Quakers have said to me, I'm not being a very good Quaker, at least my sense is, even though these Marines and sailors don't realize it, they're getting pastoral care from a Quaker right now. What I'm able to do here has everything to do with my formation in the Religious Society of Friends. And I'm not any less of a pacifist. Again, I'm happy to hear your counter arguments to this, but I wasn't really convinced that pacifism was any less legitimate in my time there, nor did I feel like, you know, I needed to come back and convince any pacifists that they weren't doing it perfectly well. I think if anything, it only crystallized my sense of how important the kind of resistance and critique work that we do from the outside is. But I also have a kind of lived belief that Quakers have some usefulness well beyond the boundaries of the Religious Society of Friends. And again, I think if you go looking for that in our tradition, you'll find lots of evidence, even if you don't believe my story or don't think where I went beyond the boundaries was a good idea. I think you'll see Woolman, right, working well beyond the boundaries of Quakerism, right? Again and again and again, you see folks working in different secular spaces, political spaces, institutional spaces, and in fact making profound contributions and doing really faithful work in those spaces. And again, we could look around this room, we could look around our monthly meeting community, and I think we would find those stories even now within our community. I guess I'll say I'm really happy for much of this time to be more conversational. Part of that is that's kind of how I'm oriented as an educator and a scholar at this point. I really, maybe I wasn't supposed to say this, Joan. I find writing to be very difficult and very lonely. I think Joan wanted me to sort of get everyone excited about writing, maybe because it is lonely and it is hard. I find writing to be really lonely and very hard. And I think actually maybe my Quakerism and my Quakerness is maybe where some of that comes from, is that I don't actually, how shall I say, I am not a believer that the best things just come from one brain. I think the best things come from communities. And I think, this is just my faith claim, I think the best things come through a community that's taking seriously the relationship with God. So particularly academic writing is like really, really far away from that, right? And a lot of kind of academic culture really wants to recommend that you shouldn't be connected to your community, much less God. I mean, deeply problematic, right, in that. But I keep trying to be as sincere and authentic in who I am, even in the midst of some academic spaces that maybe don't support that particular kind of commitment. And you'll find in this book, in any of the books that have my name on it, that there are other voices that are included and represented and highlighted in those published books, because I don't think my one voice all by itself is anywhere near sufficient to be able to speak to the questions that I'm interested in being in conversation with. So I would really look to our conversation as an opportunity to kind of do this better. I think publishing, from my perspective, at its best and at its most useful, is invitational toward communities of engagement, right? That there are probably enough dusty bookshelves in the world already, and what we could use more of is community engagement and good resources for community engagement. The greatest failure of my Goatwalking book is that it is absurdly overpriced, as much academic publishing is, which is, of course, structurally speaking, totally debilitating to the very thing that I want any of my writing to do, right? Which is to be resourceful to communities. But if communities can't afford to read your book, well, guess what? It doesn't really matter what your aspirations are. So all of that is to say, I'm very apologetic of that, and confessional even to that failure of the publication process. And again, this wasn't just my contribution. This was Brill, an academic publisher, saying to a bunch of Quaker folks, wouldn't you like to write these books? And a bunch of folks gave a lot of time and energy to write books that are now $80+ to secure. So beyond that failure, I guess I would say to you, I hope to continue to work on the growing edges of some of what is suggested in the book. I look forward to hopefully doing some more publishing in that area, because I think there is more to engage, certainly beyond anything that is within those covers. I think we're really just beginning to scratch the surface. And I have really delighted and celebrated in the number of conversations I've had with Quaker chaplains, with Quakers who are spiritual directors, with Quakers who are doing good work in their monthly meeting communities, who are sharing from their stories, how are they bringing their Quaker DNA into this, into their caring ministries, again, in different designated roles in that, but how they're finding that work to be, as I say, appropriate and resonant to what pastoral care is all about. So I don't know exactly how we would want to have a dialogue at this point, but I'm more than happy to use our time that way. I think a conversation with all of you would be better than me just continuing to talk at you. So if we can open that space and have that conversation, I would love that.
Joan, do you want to? You're muted, Joan.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yes, I think it would be great if people have questions. Why don't you put the questions in the chat? And if you, I mean, one of the things I wondered was, Zachary, whether you've ever thought of writing something about this for something like Friends Journal. Maybe you've already written for Western Friend and I've missed it. It feels like there's some definitional things here that are really important and would be very helpful.
Yeah, I haven't done that, Joan, but I take your question, your suggestion. I should take that. I hear that, and I take that seriously. And one of those questions with any kind of publication is, who do we reach? by our publishing, right? And I think Friends Journal or Western Friend would be opportunities to certainly reach people that this book won't reach for one reason or another, and to be again intentional about those opportunities. Thank you.
Zach, if
Yes,
I can,
Liz.
yeah, contribute. We are, you're probably not aware of Quaker Quicks, which is an effort in Britain to publish shorter things about Quakers, and it's got an outreach to a much broader community. And I would really love for you to be in touch with Jennifer Kavanaugh, who has been drafting people to do the Quaker Quicks books. So,
And
this is the point of QUIP. You know, this is why I'm so glad we all get together.
Okay.
So anyway.
Yeah, it's Quaker Quicks, not Quaker Quips, Quicks,
Right.
and it stems in Britain. I see one person saying something that I kind of would like to know. I think I know what goat walking means, but it would perhaps be helpful if you would define it. I was actually picturing the goats I know and where they walk, and so I was able to figure out some of this, but we'd love to hear what your definition, what your imagination would be about it.
Okay. Well, the first thing I want to say is, if you haven't read Corbett's Goat Walking book recently, I would encourage you back there. It's just a wonderful text, and his definition, or I should say, his resistance to defining it is a better definition than what I can offer to you here. Where so I'll try to give at least some sketch of what that is. Simply put, Corbett, practically speaking, in the company of two milk-producing goats, could be himself and his goat companions could be sustainable even in very arid desert climates of the borderlands between what's the United States called now, and Mexico, which is where he was spent most of his life. And there's not a lot of vegetation in that area, but goat's milk is very nutritious in this kind of way. And so between the milk and what he could glean, even from this very desert climate, he was, as a human creature, was able to sustain himself. But what he speaks about there is not a kind of ownership or control of these goats as a part of this process, but what he describes as the symbiotic relationship between himself and the goats during these walks. And that symbiotic relationship was something that I really wanted to emphasize in how I used it in terms of thinking about pastoral theology and pastoral care, that if we're providing care for someone, it's really not a kind of one-way charitable or pitying kind of gesture, but it really is something that's co-created between care provider and care seeker in that kind of way. And even the way that we term that seems to suggest a kind of transactional or kind of one directional kind of way. And Corbett was really clear that human supremacy was a part of the kind of colonial and empire project. And he wasn't just interested in sort of pontificating on that. He said, look, this is what it looks like, and this is what we'll do. And when he went on these goat walks, again, he was doing sort of a couple of things, all with some really kind of beautiful alignment. He was saying, I'm demonstrating that it's possible to live unplugged from American consumerism, American materialism, all of the kind of inundation and oversaturation of our media and our technology and our culture that just says to us, you're never enough, you're never going to have enough, get some more, get the new thing, buzz, 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 buzz. And Corbett said, I see all of that for what it is, and it doesn't need to be like any of that. But he wasn't just abdicating, right? He wasn't just resigning himself to, American empire and consumerism is terrible, and so I'm just going to shake my fist at it. As he's on these goat walks, what he's doing is actually mapping out the terrain to find the best and safest trails for asylum-seeking refugees in the process of this. So to me, that's also very instructive, right? When we think about the kind of resistance and protest work that we do we also seek after the kind of constructive elements of that work that are also necessary, right? It's not enough to have some beautiful pithy thing written on a cardboard sign. We've got to be thinking about the constructive dimensions of this. Corbett is such a magnificent inspiration to all of us, Quakers and non-Quakers alike, to really think about the kind of balance or alignment between those things in really important kind of ways. It's not enough to just say, I don't like this, right? We've got to really find ways to live into and show that we have an alternative to this in this kind of way. Now, Corbett he wasn't in American Empire and then out of American Empire. Part of what his example really shows us is a need for real engagement of American Empire. So he's not just sort of saying, again, I resign myself to this, I'm stepping out of it. But he's saying, no, I'm going to continue to work as an educator, as an activist, as an advocate in the midst of empire. But I also know that for the sake of my own well-being, I'm going to have to periodically unplug from this so that I can reset to a true baseline, right? Not an Americanized baseline. Periodically, and that's when the goat walking, as a spiritual practice, was really very significant for him. So the practicalities, as well as the kind of relevant philosophy and theology, all of that is within Corbett's text.
Thanks.
So again, I point you back there.
Thank you so much. And Chuck Fager has told us that it's in print again and has given information in the chat about it. And there was a question about Brill Publishing, and I'm going to get to that. Who was the person that asked that question? You want to say it out loud, perhaps, because I can't find it in the chat anymore.
Sure, just responding to the comment on Brill's pricing making your book unaffordable, Zach, if I understand you. Yeah?
Yes,
yeah.
I did say those things.
Yeah, I've worked in academic publishing, and I guess that just is the genre that you were in, a religious studies academic series, I presume. Did they ever offer to ask you to raise the funds to make the book free to read online, which is a trend in Europe, perhaps more than on your side of the Atlantic? But I mean, it would have cost 9,000 sterling, 8,000 sterling when I worked at Cambridge University Press. But it would mean that everybody in the world can read it because it's free. It's just an option to crowdfund the next time. Mm-hmm. If you work with that kind of publisher.
Yeah, thank you. That wasn't something that was put on the table, but I certainly would have, for the very reasons that I've described here, I certainly would have pursued that, and will look for that opportunity, or even ask for that opportunity proactively if it's not put on the table. Thank you. Thank you.
There are other publishers that are doing that. I just recently, the other day, actually, got a book that way, which was a total surprise. So. Are there questions that I've missed? Sing it out.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yes, Iris. Iris has a question.
Zach, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. It's really given me a lot to think about. I'm wondering if you consider your writing a ministry. As you do think of pastoral care as a ministry, and if so, would you say more about writing as ministry?
Iris, I guess I have to say to you that I struggle so much feeling myself to be adequate to the work of writing that I guess I should say I often struggle with feeling adequate to do ministry work too. So maybe it is a ministry. Maybe that's the pressure test right there that question takes me to. I have to say I have not really self-identified, as writing as ministry nearly as strongly as it would be much easier for me. In other words, I would feel much much clearer to claim teaching as ministry, or even some of the workshops or consulting work that I do as ministry. Again, what really challenges me around this question of ministry is if our writing is just a sort of proclamation, into the wind, and doesn't have an opportunity for real substantive community engagement, that's the tension that I feel about it. So if I were to liken how I understand writing as ministry to our tradition of traveling ministry, writing and publishing to me, and again, I hope I'm not hurting anyone's sort of mind or heart by saying this, writing to me honestly feels more like purchase of a bus ticket. It feels like the way to get to the ministry, right? And the ministry really is that community engagement. And again, this is why I'm so confessional about the overprice on the book, is that it feels like I've gotten a ticket that took me out into the middle of nowhere, and I went looking for community, and no community was able to afford to get there with me, right? And so I see the problem of that, right? At a structural level, I see the problem of that. And what I try to do, at least with the books that I've published, have really been to not just say that other voices are important, but to actually bring other voices into the space, right? All of my books point in the direction of conversation, but do that in as embodied a way as possible, right? Rather than me just saying, you, the reader, matter too, or your community matters too. Well, what if community voices were also allowed, given the space, authorized to speak their wisdom in those same pages? I think that's the reason why I'm committed to continuing to write in that way, is to interrupt, even if I can't ultimately change all of the ways in which particularly academic publishing often works. If I could bring other voices with me, it would embody community engagement even within the written text. But where I really want us to get to is the place where we in community can really engage with these resources beyond that. That's the part that really feels like ministry. So that's where I am today with it, Iris. I really appreciate that question. And as I say, I really struggle to self-identify with writing as ministry. I know many wonderful folks for whom that is something that has settled more in their ministry identity, and I celebrate that. But I really do struggle with that for some of those reasons. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I see Chuck's hand.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Zach. I've had my own experiences parallels yours in a couple of ways here, which I think I'd like to mention a little bit. One is come out of differently from you, a military family, wound up managing Quaker House, a peace project right next to Fort Bragg, one of the biggest military bases, deeply and totally immersed in a military town. And Quaker House has been doing that for 53 years. And that ministry has, we've had, I mean, I didn't do it for 53 years, but the staff there over those years has had to evolve and adapt to all kinds of changes and evolutions. But they've had plenty to do, and it's been supported by friends, and they've got plenty to do now, for Pete's sake. And so you don't get any beef from me about ended up being a chaplain in the military, because the idea that any of us Americans are free of being involved in and complicit with, if we want to put a negative spin on it, with the military, the war machine, that's just wishful thinking. Sorry, no innocence here. But taking your ministry into that setting, there's nothing intrinsically bad about that, or on Quakerly either. I mean, you got to do your face your challenges like anybody else. And then the other parallel is that I've long been a Jim Corbett follower, so to speak. And it's actually, I carried a concern for a long time to somehow get that book back into print, because I felt it's it would be on the shelf with about a half a dozen others of some of the most valuable Quaker writing in my time, 50 some years among friends. And we don't have a surplus of stuff that valuable. So we need to keep that and keep it available. And it was just buried, in the sand of lost books. And then the chance came, and actually I had a wonderful time working with mostly we were all volunteers. None of us got paid to get that book back in print. And another group, sort of an overlapping group, which I was not personally part, also got his second book, which is called Sanctuary for All Life, back into print as well. So his oeuvre, his Old Testament and New Testament, so to speak, he would chuckle at that, I think, are back available now. And actually, Goatwalking, the new edition, has sold several hundred copies in the past year. So that's not bad for a Quaker book. And it is possible to do that. We did it with no money. We didn't have any capital. Fooey on this academic book. And the prices are between $10 and $15 for each of those books. And people make money. We're not even anti-capitalist about it. You can make money doing that.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks a lot. I see John Lampin has his hand up. John.
Yes, I'd very much like, Zachary, to take you back to what you were saying about other voices being in the book, or in the books. And because of my particular working life, which I won't try and tell you now, I'm very aware of the wisdom and the stories of people who don't use print as a media. Some of them are literally illiterate, others, it's not the natural way to express themselves. And what that leads me to is to ask, since I've not read any of your books, how much of your books do you spend telling stories that bring other people into the book, even though it's not verbal quotation written quotation?
Yeah, thanks for that question, John. In different books, sort of with different kind of arc within the narrative or the argumentation of the book, I've done it in some different ways. I think one of the sort of common practices with it is, as someone who spends a lot of time reading books, when I'm reading a book by a single author in a kind of single author voice, even without the author going out of their way to telling me how smart they are, right? The very performance of a monograph that is published, right? And again, all of the sort of industry and political capital that comes with publishing, there is a way that very implicitly the statement is, this is someone who is accomplished and intelligent at a very high level. And in that, as a reader, I am sort of plugging in to their expertise. The way in which this was deconstructed in some ways helpfully in the teaching space was Paulo Freire saying, this is the banking model of education, right? There's an expert, and then there's a bunch of us who just sort of open up the top of our heads, and the teacher puts the information inside. And many of us sort of say, yes, we've seen education like that. And what I struggle with is, I've read a lot of books that are about the banking model of education, and yet they're written as monographs that essentially are performing and reinscribing the exact same set of assumptions, right? John is the expert, and I am the sort of recipient of John's brilliance and expertise. And listen, I don't don't disbelieve that there are brilliant people out there who write brilliant monographs. I love them, but I'm not one of those people. I'm not somebody who's the smartest person in the room. And so it would seem a bit of a fool's errand for me to either try to promote myself that way or even try to work toward that end. Because to me, the best stuff that I've ever been a part of has been more relational. It's been more about community engagement. So that's the sort of common thesis of why I write that way. How I work it in happens in some different ways. So in the Goatwalking text, I'm really dialoguing with Corbett's, as Chuck was just saying, the available material that Corbett has published. Sanctuary for All Life was published, I believe, after Corbett's death, actually, and again, very limited, but is now in reprint, which is excellent. So dialoguing with Corbett's text in these ways, although again, I hope you heard me say very clearly, I am engaging those texts in ways that Corbett was very clear did not want to be engaged with by these sorts of academic ways of doing that. So I think at its best, I'm not just engaging his material academically, but also devotionally. Corbett, as Chuck was just saying, Corbett has been a profound influence and inspiration to my own faith journey. And I don't want to disrespect him any more than I have to in writing this book. I want to really be able to celebrate his faith, his testimony, because it has been impactful to me. I know it's been impactful to others, and I believe it will continue to be impactful for others. But also in that same volume, I turn toward a handful of Quaker chaplains to share some of their lived experience, some of the testimony kind of from the front lines of ministry that they're working on, as a way to essentially hold a kind of symbiotic, hopefully, balance between my author voice and their author voice, right? By allowing their voice to speak not in a pick and pull quoting kind of way, but really to invite the sturdiness and the integrity of their author voice to be included in full, in other words, in that text. That's a different way of engaging with voices, right? Not just let me read your book and decide what I agree with and I'll quote that, or I think this proves my point, so I'll cite you, but rather to allow the clarity and the vitality of their experience to be what it is, which is a profound inspiration and truly a blessing to the text in that kind of way. Again, for me to say in the book, there are lots of Quaker chaplains out there. I mean, that's nice. That's a nice thing to say. That's a true thing to say, even. But for you to be able to not even have to set the book down, to go hear for some really faithful Quakers working in ministry right now, to me is a sort of next step, right? It's don't just hear me saying this, but see, right? Allow this to be a show, not a tell, as far as the work of that goes. And quite frankly, their voices are my favorite part of the book. They are the parts that I say, this is good. And in this way, I think the work of publishing, again, at least where I'm committed to it, it seems like a certain kind of a privilege to be able to publish in these ways, to have access in these ways. Toni Morrison has a very beautiful quote where she talks about being hired into faculty positions within the academy and says, if you get into those positions and are not serious about trying to free somebody else, that this was all for naught, right? The whole opportunity implicit in you being able to get some access, to get some of this agency and this opportunity, is to not just be good on you, but to in some way help to strengthen the voices in your community and the voices around you. To me, I take that commitment into the writing, right? How, just as you were saying, John, how could voices that would not otherwise be featured or publishable in these kinds of ways, right? Recognizing the industrial factors in who gets published and who doesn't get published, it's of the utmost importance that those voices be amplified in the publishing that I do for some of these reasons. But thank you for that question, John. I love that question, and I take it very seriously.
I'm noting Philip Gross has something in the chat which he can't say because he doesn't have that facility on his machine. A nod of respect to your leading to be among people of very different lives and perspectives in a world dividing increasingly into communities of like-mindedness. Would you say that being among unlike-mindedness, not to argue and persuade, but to listen, may be a Quaker testimony in itself?
It's a beautiful question.
Hasn't it always been a testimony?
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would wonder in addition to that question is it a testimony if it only works inside Quakerism?
Right.
Because this is the tyranny of the echo chamber, right? Well, we got together and we said, this sounds good. But we never actually took it outside and let it breathe and let it walk around and let it meet some other people. Is that a testimony? I mean, I'd be happy to spend the rest of the day chewing on that with all of you. I think that's a great question. I'll also say to you, 2 days ago, I was in Houston, Texas, talking to well, I should say, gathered in a space where I was doing some teaching about moral injury and care for veterans and military families, in a space in which being a Southern Baptist in Texas was very normalized. And I felt like, boy, I am a stranger in a strange land, right? I am not in a like-minded place. Yeah, Liz is nodding her head like she might know something about Texas. Okay. So, and yet, okay, in the midst of this space where people were theologizing and people were making faith claims that are really profoundly divergent from me, we were gathered together, not because we vote the same way or are like-minded in this kind of way. We were gathered around the need and the urgency of the need to provide better care, more effective care for trauma survivors, right? So a very un-Quaker space, but I would say work that's really, really important. And I felt so grateful to be there, right? Even though I was like, whoa, to some of the stuff that got put out there, again, with like no apology, no like, you know, I'm holding my breath to see how this lands. Like, nope, we're just going to put some stuff out there and like, it's just going to be fine. And I was like, whoa, I don't know about some of this stuff. And yet in that space, there was an opportunity for us to try to deepen and strengthen the work that we were doing. Really, really important work. And that is what my work in the military also felt a lot like. It was a very difficult and discomforting space to work in. But it was clear to me that it was good space to be in and that there was good work that could happen in that space, right? So sort of parsing that a little bit, I think is necessary for us to think about where can we show up with integrity and authenticity and do good work. It may not be in places where we're all of one mind or all of the same values and commitments. I think there are spaces like that where we can still do good work.
Thank you, Zachary. That is a great place for us to bring this to a close, I believe, because it's now a little after 12. There's a couple of small questions in the chat you could look at, Zachary, and just answer perhaps to them individually or whatever. But let's, Iris, how shall we transition from this to our break? Is that what we're doing?
Yes. I think just by, again, expressing our gratitude to Zach for what you've brought today. And I'm already feeling that you've shed some light on, we'll add to our discussion in our business meeting about the future of QUIP. So I really appreciate that. And I think we all agreed that the planning committee agreed we need to have some time for people to get up and stretch, not go too far away, but return for business meeting at 30 minutes after whatever hour you're in.
Iris, can I remind people that we did record this, and so if you came in late, you might really want to watch the recording because it was just very powerful. And thank you so much, Zach. it was really wonderful having you.
And we might think of sharing this with our meetings. I know I'm already planning to do that. Again,
Right.
thank you so much. Yes.
The video will go up eventually on the QUIP website, but I think we'll probably do a mailing to everybody who's here, to the membership, basically. So make sure you're on the membership list. I think most of you must be if you got here. So thanks.
Zachary, you may want to check also, there are some folks who would like to email with you, and so that's all in the chat. If you can, I unfortunately am on my Chromebook and it will not let me save the chat, which really frustrates me.
I think we might let some of the chat become available to somehow to all of us. We'll try.
All right. So again, thank you very much, Zachary, so much for being here and sharing and reminding us about Jim Corbett, a very important person. So thank you.